There was a time in Hampton Roads when it seemed that anything was possible. The war was over, and our boys were home. The automobile replaced the streetcar. Bridges and tunnels replaced the ferries. You could snuggle with your date under the stars at a drive-in theater and eat at a drive-in restaurant. A new kind of music was playing on the radio. You could take a boat to Baltimore or a train to just about anywhere. And Newport News built the world's fastest ship. Hampton Roads was growing, but in the face of all the progress and prosperity of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, some of our favorite things disappeared. And although they may be gone, they are not forgotten. America was on the move, and life began to pick up speed. We rekindled our love affair with the automobile and took to the highways. New forms of business and entertainment grew out of the automobile's popularity. A new kind of movie theater sprang up. Now, instead of driving downtown and competing for a few parking spaces, you could drive to an outdoor theater and watch movies in the privacy of your own car. Jerry Gordon owned several drive-in theaters, including the Anchor in Newport News.
They called them lovers' lanes, but actually they weren't, because our primary business was families, because you could bring the whole family out in the car and you didn't need a babysitter.
Gas we could use? No, we can't take a chance. It might poison the whole city.
Drive-in theaters weren't necessarily known for the quality of movies shown, but you would always see a double feature, and the concession stand is where the action was.
Visit our concession and see for yourself the delicious treats, drinks, and snacks awaiting you. If you are thirsty, try ice-cold soft drinks or a cup of hot, flavorful coffee. Get something to go with it, like a sizzling and satisfying hot dog or a tasty, tender sandwich. Try one of these delicious treats, and you'll be back at the concession for more before the show is over.
We had what we called an intermission clock trailer we would show on the screen, which was a clock, and it would have a hand. It would say 14 minutes until showtime, 13 minutes until showtime. Go to the concession stand and buy a pizza or a Coke or a Pepsi or whatever, and it was a madhouse because everybody came at one time.
Is everybody happy? Then let's go. It's showtime.
The drive-in theaters offered more than just movies on the screen.
We had church there on Sunday mornings sometimes. The preacher would stand up on top of the concession stand, which was flat, and we'd give him a microphone, and he would speak over the in-car speakers, and people did their sunrise service and worshiping right in the cars.
By 1958, the country's 4,000 drive-ins were doing a booming business on cheap land. But as people moved from the cities to the suburbs, the land became more valuable, and the drive-ins began to give way to the developers' bulldozers. Shopping malls and subdivisions now occupy the drive-in theater sites. But we fondly remember the time when their projectors filled the night air with action and adventure as we sat with our sweethearts under the stars.
There was an old chestnut going around about a man who came to the cashier and told the cashier that his wife was in the theater with another man, and he didn't really want to cause any trouble, but he might cause trouble if they didn't make an announcement and have him leave. So the manager didn't want any trouble, so they made the announcement that there's a woman in here with a man who's not her husband, and so after the announcement, 90% of the cars left the drive-in theater.
After the movies, there were new places that also catered to the car set. The drive-in restaurant became a popular gathering place.
The people would park at the curb, and a curb girl or one of the girls would come out on the curb and get their order and take it back in. That's why they got the curb girls, because they worked the curb.
The drive-in restaurant became the place to take a date and show off to your friends.
And you'd show off, you'd sit on the front row, show your date off, and show your automobile off, but both at the same time. The automobile craze really went strong right after the war, and there was and the business just boomed.
After prospering well into the 50s, the drive-ins suddenly found their popularity challenged by an aggressive new type of restaurant that didn't offer curb service, which meant you had to go in and order at a counter, and there was nowhere to sit and eat inside. But their food was cheap and fast.
In 1956, the fast food places came into Norfolk, and they opened up on Military Highway, sold 10-cent hamburgers, but they really went strong, and there were one hamburger chain after another started in around 1956, and that was the end of the drive-ins. They took all the business, and the drive-ins closed up one at a time.
Except for Dumars and one or two other survivors, the local drive-ins where we all used to go to meet and eat fell victim to progress.
I can't understand why they don't have more drive-ins around here now.
Even when faced with the novelty and popularity of the drive-in restaurants, there were those who said you just couldn't beat the taste of a hot dog.
Back in 1933, my father and uncle decided to open a hot dog stand on City Hall Avenue. It was a good location. They rented a small place. They put 9 stools in there, a big grill up front, a glass where people could see you when they walked by. And then when I finished high school in Maury High in 1937, I went straight to work there. My father wanted to come there and be with him. And we cooked the hot dogs on the grill. On the grill. With a bun steam and a steam table next to the grill. And pick up the rolls, get the hot dog, put it in, get the mustard, onions, and chili, and scrape it up and give it to the customer. A lot of people want just mustard, a lot of people want just chili. Some people say make the chili hot, make it not too hot. There's all kinds of ways. But it was nice serving them. There was no trouble.
And in the face of all the growing competition, the walk-up downtown hot dog joints remained well-known institutions because they had fast service and good food.
It was good stuff, and people enjoyed it. Fast service, they eat, get out. And then people say, what you do for a living? I tell them I sold hot dogs. I was a waiter, I says. The highest paid waiter in the United States, I should tell them. They thought I was joking. Yeah, I did all right.
George Bacalus sold hot dogs for 40 years on City Hall Avenue. Finally, when his lease was not renewed in 1975, he took the sign out of the window, closed his shop, and went home. An office building now stands where the people used to line up to get a hot dog from George Bacalus.
I didn't learn nothing more. I played sports all the time. I didn't learn nothing, so I went to the hot dog business. I knew the business anyway, so I stayed there. Now all my brothers went the other way. They all learned, they went another way. I had a brother retired from the Air Force as a general. He did good. I had 2 other brothers retired. They all did good, except me. And I sold hot dogs, that's all.
In the early 1950s, radio stations began playing a new kind of music. Rock and roll made its raucous debut. In 1953, while visiting his sister in Norfolk, New Yorker Frank Guida saw an opportunity to make his mark in the music business.
I decided to buy a record shop that was on the verge of bankruptcy, and we got it for next to nothing at the time. Of course, we named that store on Church Street Frankie's Birdland.
As the record store prospered, Guida came up with an idea about how to produce and record music that became known as the Norfolk sound.
All of a sudden I thought of, why can't I put together a recording that would mention all the high schools in the different areas of the country? And this is what we did. It was called High School USA. That was the beginning of what was to become later on the Norfolk Sound, in that we threw a spotlight on this area to a young man called Tommy Facenda, who recorded High School USA.
I heard that this fellow, Frank Guida, that owned and operated the Birdland Record Shop over in Church Street in Norfolk, wanted to meet me. He was looking for a young kid to do this special song or something. So I went over there with Joe Royster to meet Frank. And I'll never forget it, because we went to the back, and it was like something out of one of these old 40 movies, because it seems like I remember like pushing the beads back at a Casablanca or something. There sat Frank, and Frank just looked up at me, and he said, "You're my boy. I want you to do it." And I thought to myself, hey, you know, he hadn't heard me sing.
Come Friday noon, about 3:30. High School USA. I dropped my books in my misery. High School USA. Stroll on down to the soda shop. High School USA.
And back in those days, we didn't do concerts. We did rock and roll shows. So it would be 20 people on one show. And everybody else on the tour bus would be asleep. I'd be on there with a pen light, trying to think of what state I was going in so I could learn those schools. But if it came down to where I was in a state and I forgot the schools, I would just hit Virginia. They come from Maury, Granby, Newport News, Oscar Smith, and Richmond too, Matthew, Suffolk, St. Paul, John Marshall, Bristol, Booker T, Warwick, Wilson too. Want to do the high school bop with you? Yeah. I never forgot Virginia songs.
Armstrong, Churchland, and Deep Creek, Easy Glass and Hermitage, Central Norcom and Great Bridge, North and South, Hampton too. Well, I want to do the high school bop with you. Yeah.
Although High School USA made it to number 28 on the Billboard Popular Music Chart, Frank was dissatisfied in its production and performance on Atlantic Records. He vowed that next time he would do everything himself, but that would require a recording studio. So he bought one.
I'd already written a song called New Orleans with a young man at the time called Joe Royster, who did a lot of the lyrics, but for the most part the arrangement was where I was, and the recording aspects of it. The concept of it was somewhat revolutionary. I decided I'm not going to take this record to New York. I'm going to do everything myself. And so I did. And I think it's probably the most historical recording that was ever made.
Frank approached Norfolk singer Gary Anderson. And although Anderson wasn't too thrilled about the song, he couldn't turn down an opportunity to record. The production sounded different, raw, overmodulated, and dominated by a new drum beat.
Well, come on, everybody, take a trip with me. Well, down to Mississippi, down to New Orleans. They got the honeysuckle blooming on the honeysuckle vine. And the love is a blooming there all the time. You know, every Southern belle is a Mississippi queen. Down to Mississippi, down in New Orleans. I said, hey, yeah. I knew that my recording of New Orleans, I felt, was a terrific recording, but that doesn't mean a thing, really, if it's not heard. So I decided, how am I going to have this recording listened to? So I said, well, I'm going to have to use a gimmick. Well, what really struck me was when I walked out onto Princess Anne Road, which was where my original recording studio was. I looked at a sign in front of a sandwich shop called Cobb's Sandwich Shop. Now, Mr. Cobb was a man who sold United States saving bonds. And I looked at the sign and saw U.S. bonds. I said, my goodness, why can't I do the same thing he's doing, but I'll put it on a recording and rename my artist U.S. Bonds. When it was received by the radio stations, they would think it was a public service recording. I shipped the record out, took
to radio stations everywhere, and fortunately it worked.
New Orleans climbed rapidly to the #6 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and was soon followed by another innovative hit by U.S. Bonds. Quarter to Three went all the way to #1. Not bad for two locally produced records sung by a kid from Norfolk.
Don't you know that I danced till the quarter to 3 up in the head that night with Daddy G. But everybody was as happy as they could be, 'cause they was singing with my Daddy G. I blow Daddy, I blow sweet Daddy, yeah, 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 yeah. I just a little bit of soul now. Oh, yeah.
I think this is probably the most historical contribution made by Norfolk, in that we saved, literally saved, rock and roll music. As a matter of fact, and this is fact, Dick Clark's American Bandstand was going to be canceled by ABC in 1961. When we appeared on the show, Dick Clark and his producer stated, and I quote him, "Frank, if it hadn't been for quarter to 3, our show would have been canceled."
Although his record stores are gone, Frank Guida and his Norfolk musicians and singers gave the popular music scene a new, exciting sound. Borrowing from many musical traditions, the Norfolk sound was, and still is, a significant force in the music industry.
The whole industry was watching what we were doing. We were in the charts, thank the good Lord, for almost 5 years. We always had something in the top 10. And I guess if Norfolk had been aware of its historical significance in music, we probably would have had the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame here instead of Cleveland.
You know that I danced till the quarter to 3 up in the head that night with Daddy G. Everybody was as happy as they could be, 'cause they was singing with my Daddy G. I blow Daddy, I blow Daddy, yeah, 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 yeah,
On a clear September day in 1919, a young seafood salesman named Lightfoot Michaud pitched a tent on the corner of Jefferson Avenue and 19th Street in the heart of the black community in Newport News. There, he and his wife Mary began conducting high-spirited gospel services that would eventually secure a place in history for the Happy Am I preacher.
The people themselves would stand around the tent, or they would come in and sit down because they were compelled by the beautiful music that they heard the choir singing. And Elder Michaud would be standing in front, talking or singing along with the choir, and his wife, Mrs. Mary Eliza Pauline Michaud, would be sitting on the stage helping the choir to sing. And the people would be very, very animated because the choir and Elder and Sister Michaud were very animated people. They were very happy people.
He captivated people not so much by his preaching, but by his showmanship. He had a charisma, he had a way with people that he could almost lay you out and you would almost say, thank you, Elder.
Michaud's use of radio is one of the first examples in this country of using the mass media to advance a cause. And although some people thought showmanship had no place in religion, Michaud saw nothing negative about it. He used the show as a tool for drawing crowds to preach to, and people could get religion at home by listening to his broadcasts from Newport News on station WGH.
He was quite popular on the air, even then. He had a feeling, and of course it was radio, as you know, there was no, there's no television, but he had a feeling that that was the thing that would catapult his ministry. He felt that that was the thing that would help the church to get the message out, and he used it to a hilt.
My precious ones, the sermon tonight will be built around a great subject. Amen. Or a question, rather. The text is found in Mark, the 12th chapter, and the 23rd verse. Yes. The woman that have had 3 husbands, they all have died, gone to heaven. In heaven, whose wife will she be? I see some of you sisters getting very anxious. But this text will not be preached until the collection have been raised. Come forward, my lamb.
The 1930s were known as radio's golden age, and by 1933, 52 radio stations beamed Michaud's Washington, D.C. program to millions of listeners from coast to coast.
Elder Michaud was happy most of the time, as I said, because of his salvation. But then he had a great respect for people, all people, white, black. He didn't care what your nationality was. He didn't care what your standing was in the community. He had no fear of presidents or mayors or city officials or what have you.
Michaud became a friend of President and Mrs. Roosevelt during their tenure in the White House, and for years appeared at prominent functions with the President and the First Lady.
Elder Michaud was unique in his religious philosophy, for one thing, and there was a certain amount of respect that was given him because of his church philosophy. And whenever any of these so-called dignitaries would come to the area, he would be there.
When I reach the other side, Pilgrim, the first place I shall visit, Pilgrim, shall be down by the riverside, Pilgrim.
By far, some of the most exciting of all Michaud's church events were the baptisms he administered in the James River at Newport News. He led parades of white-clad followers down to the riverside, where hundreds watched the ritual.
Pinkett's Beach, commonly known as Pinky's Beach, at the end of Ivy Avenue in Newport News, Virginia, was the original site of the first baptizing services ever held by Elder Michaud. Now, Elder Michaud knew that the baptizings were symbolic, because he often would say, or he had sometimes had said, it is possible to go down in that water, a dry center, and come back up still, a wet center.
In 1950, Michaud baptized hundreds of people at Griffith Stadium in water he had shipped in from the River Jordan. Offloaded from a ship at the Newport News shipyard, the water was trucked to the stadium where it was emptied into a huge baptismal tank. Over 20,000 people witnessed the baptism. By the mid-50s, the faithfulness that he inspired among church members began to dissipate. Progress was changing the population, and succeeding generations of churchgoers began to assume more control over their lives and those of their families.
I remember Mrs. Michaud because she taught the young ladies, and she taught them, she said, to be a peach out of reach. She was a stickler for purity. And she meant just what she said, that you will not be a street person. You will live this life. You will live the life of Jesus Christ.
On October 28, 1967, Maury Michaud died. Almost a year to the day later, after proclaiming he no longer desired to live, Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud was dead. He was laid to rest in Newport News.
He was the showman, but she was the person in the back taking care of the business. He had all of the charisma, but the business was carried on by, as far as I'm concerned, by Mrs. Michaud. And at her death, he was quite lost.
Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud had risen from peddling fish to counseling presidents. A forerunner of today's genre of media-oriented preachers, the Happy Am I preacher, Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud, was a great orator, businessman, showman, and a resident of Hampton Roads.
I think the thing that I remember most about Elder Michaud and his wife, Mrs. Mary Eliza Pauline Michaud, was the fact that they lived what they preached. They were great examples of the Word of God.
And he liked for you to call that whole name. He liked all of it. Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud, the Happy Am I preacher.
Hampton Roads grew up around the water. From the very first settlers, we have worked in partnership with it, and we've always had great respect for how water has made this area unique in so many ways. At one time in Hampton Roads, fleets of long, low boats used to crisscross the waters of the rivers and the bay to harvest the abundance of oysters. The firm of J.S. Darling & Son was established in 1884.
In the Civil War, the town of Hampton was burned. And after the war was over, they wanted to reconstruct the town. And my great-grandfather, who has my name, James S. Darling, had a coasting schooner. And he brought finished lumber down to Hampton to be used in the restoration of the town. And he liked it so well that he made another trip and brought his family down. And old JSD was in something of a wheeler dealer. He was in a lot of different sorts of businesses. And in 1884, he was particularly interested in getting started in the oyster business.
The business of taking oysters from the bottom of the rivers and the bay was incredibly hard work and took a certain type of person to do it.
If you go out and tongue in James River, or if you're on a dredge boat, there are not so many of those left anymore, shoveling oysters onto a conveyor belt, dumping them, pulling on the dredges and all the rest of it. This is no job for somebody who isn't physically strong. And all this seems to work together to create that special class of people who have worked on the water in Virginia and indeed all over the world.
To me, it's not hard, but to some people it looks hard, but you make it, either way you want to go, it's hard or easy. But if you're used to it, it's not hard. Because I've done it all my life, and I don't know, it's just in my blood. 90% of the people, it's in their blood. I'm a horseman. I'm not just a regular horseman, I'm a waterman.
JSD & Son not only ran oyster boats, but they built an oyster processing plant, a marine railway, and a boatyard to service the other watermen who operated boats in the area.
We dealt, for the most part, with the crabbers, with the fishermen, and people like that who were dependent on this, on their working boats for a living. And so we didn't do a great deal of the fine work, but we kept an awful lot of boats on the water and working out of Hampton Creek for many, many years.
The Darling Oyster Processing Plant was famous not only for the quantity of oysters it produced, but also for the huge piles of oyster shells next to the plant. They became a landmark.
Well, they were so large that they were virtually a symbol for the city of Hampton, and there are many pictures of them around. They were put on postcards, and they went all the way across the country. And when in the mid-30s we were probably shucking between 250 and 300,000 bushels of a season, there would be an enormous amount of oysters that would be used there.
For decades, the oystermen worked off their boats with tongs and dredges and brought their harvest to processing plants like the Darlings. But as progress industrialized the shores of the rivers and bay, the oysters began to die.
Disease. They claim it's overharvest. It's not overharvest. I got private oyster ground on the Severn River off the Mobjack Bay. I planted shells, 35,000 bushels of shells in 18 months. And when I went back next year, they were gone. They were dead.
It's just a great tragedy, whether the attempts by the scientists to bring in oysters that will be resistant to these diseases, Lord knows they would be wonderful. On the other hand, the traditional Chesapeake Bay oyster has a taste that is just second to nothing.
Yeah, I believe they'll come back if they will get this pollution out of the bay. It's not overharvesting. It's not killing the oyster. It's just pollution.
As the oyster beds died out and the huge piles at the Darling plant diminished, the oyster boats left the waters of the bay for good.
In the old days, when an old boat was retired, it would be stripped and often towed by another boat or a tug or something up a creek and just simply put up there in a deserted area and allowed to go to pieces.
The oyster piles are gone, and so is the boatyard, replaced by hotels and parking garages and tourist centers. The waters are now filled with sailboats and powerboats, and the signature of progress is everywhere. It's a far cry from the days when the shellfish reigned supreme in Hampton Roads.
I'm an oysterman, I'm a crabber, I'm a fisherman, I'm a clammer. But you got people in the business that don't do nothing but oyster. If they cannot oyster, they can't do nothing else.
Before the time of the interstates and airliners, passenger trains pulled by powerful steam locomotives were a familiar sight in Hampton Roads, churning out clouds of smoke and creating an unmistakable sound that reverberated across the land. The trains were our link to towns and cities in neighboring states and across the country. And although they were very popular and practical, traveling by train could be an adventure.
Norfolk Western put on the Powhatan Arrow after the war, which was a first-class train. Went from here to Cincinnati and Ohio in 16 hours. And it used to run at times, not all the time, but at times it would run 100 to 110 miles an hour between Norfolk and Petersburg, especially if it was a little bit late. The engineer going to make up the time. And you could be at South Norfolk when the Arrow came in at night, around midnight. When he came around the curve at South Norfolk, he was putting on brakes to be stopping at Union Station. And every wheel was a solid ring of fire.
The Union Station was headquarters for 3 railroads and the center of passenger rail service in Norfolk. Built in 1912 at the foot of East Main Street and Lake Avenue, it was regarded as one of the most beautiful buildings in Norfolk. Its elegant waiting room with polished marble columns and carved ceiling witnessed countless thousands of travelers. For 51 years, the station was filled with the sounds of trains and of greetings and goodbyes.
Yeah, my brother Raymond, he went in the Army on October the 27th, 1943. I went with Raymond to Union Depot the night he left here. And that's the last place any of my family ever saw. I was the last one to see him. And I always recall, just before he boarded the train, I hugged him. I called him Butch. I said, Butch, bring me back a medal. He said, I'll do that for you, brother. He called me brother. That's the last time I ever saw him. So that's why Union Depot was always special to me. We did get a medal from him, but it was a hard way. He was killed in northern Italy on the 17th of October, 1944.
Outside the station, some train engineers had a distinctive way of sounding the train's whistle. If the air was still, far off in the distance, you could hear the whistle and almost swear the engineer was playing a tune.
I work with an engineer named Leon Jones, and he is Herb Jones' father. He could play tunes on the whistle. He tried to teach me, and I couldn't learn. He'd come through Ward's Corner, and he lived down near Ocean View, and he would play "I'm Coming Home" on the whistle to let his wife know he was going through Ward's Corner.
As much a part of our lives as the big steam trains were, by the mid-1950s, rail passenger traffic began to decline. Travel by car was less expensive, and airliners were much faster. On January 29, 1956, the last passenger train pulled out of Union Station. The station was torn down in 1963. Harbor Park now occupies the site which was once filled with the sounds of passengers' footsteps and voices mixed with the hissing steam, squealing brakes, and the mournful whistle that signaled the end of passenger rail service and Union Station. Besides the numerous ferries that connected the peninsula and eastern shore to the south side, the Baltimore Steam Packet Company operated the Old Bay Line, direct overnight steamship service from Norfolk and Old Point Comfort to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
A ship that looked to me and others something from the past, a turn-of-the-century vessel that was still being used in the 1950s. The quarters were not luxurious, but were comfortable. And it was just a fun thing to do. Part of the feeling, too, was that this service was going to end soon, since highways and bridges and other things were coming into our lives more and more each year.
The Old Point Comfort dock jutted out into the water directly in front of the Chamberlain Hotel at Fort Monroe in Hampton. At 7:30 in the evening, you could board the steamer, City of Norfolk, have dinner, gamble, get a good night's sleep in a comfortable stateroom, and be in Baltimore at 6:30 the next morning.
I remember the dining salon was looked like it might have come from an old hotel. It was nicely appointed, very clean, good waiters, and the food was quite good. It was an experience, and one prolonged one because nobody was in a hurry. It was a sentimental journey in a bit of a way, but it was also a fun thing for us. We just did it to say, we've done it.
One ship of the Old Bay Line was to find a permanent place in history. Back in 1927, the flagship of the line joined the fleet. Named for the president of the line, the President Warfield was 320 feet long and considered quite luxurious for a bay steamer. Passengers slept in 171 staterooms trimmed in ivory and gold. The pride of the line faithfully steamed the bay for 14 years. Then the war in Europe changed all that. In 1941, the United States War Shipping Administration took over the Warfield and prepared it for duty of a different sort. Her luxurious staterooms were torn out. The open decks where passengers used to watch the bay slip by were boxed in, and the once pristine white ship wore a heavy coat of gray paint. She was turned over to the British Ministry of War Transport, and for 2 years she shuttled soldiers across the Channel from England to the French beaches at Normandy. Tired and falling into disrepair by the end of the war, the President Warfield was anchored up the river with the rest of the idle fleet. But she was not to be idle for long.
After World War II was over and we had liberated all those concentration camps, it became obvious to the liberating armies, both ours, the British, the Russians, that one hell of a Holocaust had taken place. Nobody really believed it until that time. And what people don't remember is that after the war was indeed over and the camps were opened, all the people who survived, had not yet been killed by Hitler, were allowed to go, except the Jews. The Germans said, look, we don't have enough houses left after you guys have bombed us into smithereens to house our own Germans. We sure don't have enough for the Jews. They had no place to go. Nobody wanted them. But a few thought they would strike out on their own, and where they were striking out for? Palestine.
Richmond businessman Jack Bernstein was sympathetic to the plight of the Jews and set about to secure the transportation they needed to get out of Europe and into Palestine.
Jack got together with some people that he felt close to because what he was going to do was illegal. He could be thrown in jail if he was caught, plus everybody else that he was asking to join him. One of them was my father, and one or two other men from the western part of the country who formed this very small group, who decided to buy one of the mothballed ferry boats that used to ply between Norfolk and Baltimore every night up and down the Chesapeake Bay.
Bernstein and his group selected the SS President Warfield because it was already a transport ship. They bought it under the pretense that it would be hauling cargo for a Mideast trading company in the Mediterranean.
When it got to Mediterranean and to the northern shore of the Mediterranean, it was accepted, of course, by all the Jewish people who were there waiting for ships to take them across. It was the biggest thing they'd ever seen to that time. They were using small little boats that would take 8, 10, 12 people until that time. Here's one that could take, what, hundreds, maybe thousands?
On July 12, 1947, 4,554 hopeful Jewish refugees boarded the ship in Sète, France. As soon as she cleared the port, the President Warfield was renamed Exodus 1947. That voyage was chronicled on newsreels and on the front pages of newspapers around the world.
Out of Palestine comes the camera story of the Exodus, the Jewish immigrant ship that highlights new violence in the Holy Land. With a cargo of 4,500 refugees, the Exodus is the largest ship ever to attempt to run the watchful British naval blockade. After a bloody battle with a British boarding party, the refugees disembark at Haifa. Some are dying. 20 others are in a serious condition. And as the tired and weary refugees are transferred to British prison ships, 2 members of the United Nations Committee on Palestine silently look on. Displaced persons are being sent back to France.
In 1948, Israel became a nation. The rusting ship took on significance as the symbol of the new nation's birth pangs. Author Leon Uris dramatized the story, which became a best-selling novel and major motion picture.
The Exodus did become a symbol. I guess the British considered it a symbol enough to try to keep it off the shores. The Jews considered it a symbol enough to make sure it's going to get to the shores, and there were a lot of confrontations as a result.
Finally, on August 26, 1952, after sitting in the harbor of Haifa, Israel for 4 years, the pride of the old Bay Line, the heroic ship Exodus 1947 caught fire and burned to the waterline. Losing to the speed and convenience of automobile and air travel, the graceful bay steamers are gone. The last northbound run from Old Point Comfort was made on December 30th, 1959. The wharf was abandoned and razed in 1961. What's left of the hull of the President Warfield rusts at the bottom of a harbor halfway around the world. The steamer City of Norfolk was sold for scrap, closing the final chapter of the long and colorful era of the overnight passenger steamers on the Chesapeake Bay. For years, the skyline of cranes, smokestacks, and radar masts created by the men and women of the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company was dark and foreboding. But that gray skyline was soon to change. On February 8, 1950, the keel for hull number 488 was laid and construction began on the biggest passenger ship ever built in the United States. Designed by William Francis Gibbs, the SS United States was put into service as a transatlantic liner, making regular runs between New York and Southampton, England. The magnificent liner was delivered to the United States lines on June 20th, 1952. She was markedly different from the gray ships of the war. With two huge red, white, and blue funnels, glistening white decks, and red paint at the waterline, she was built for beauty and for speed.
I think most of us that worked aboard it knew when the minute we started work that was being built for speed. They wanted to set the Atlantic record, and fortunately it did that. It beat the Queen Mary's speed by several knots.
On her maiden voyage, the United States made the Atlantic crossing in an unprecedented 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes at an average speed of over 35 knots. She had shattered the old record by 10 hours. The workers at the Newport News shipyard had built the fastest ship in the world.
There were two of the Navy's newest destroyers that went with us, and we left them. We had that much speed. Everyone had said we attained 50 land miles an hour. It was quite a sight to see the wake off the stern of it, and to see these two new destroyers trying to escort us, and we left them miles behind.
Although not as luxurious as other liners of the time, many celebrities and royalty preferred the United States because of her speed. Passenger Betty Luce remembers steaming to England in a first-class stateroom.
The ship was interesting in its appointments because its public rooms were quite elegant and modern, though. They reflected not an old-fashioned sense of first-class travel. They were very up-to-date. I think everybody who went on, certainly United States and other ocean liners, would talk about the food. The dining was a big deal. The menus on the ship were extraordinary, very exclusive and fancy kinds of foods for somebody from Hampton, Virginia. It was very, it was a very sophisticated experience.
The United States made yearly trips back to her birthplace in Newport News for repairs and always arrived at the holidays.
They'd want probably 3 months' worth of work done in 3 weeks, and this meant around the clock for everybody.
It was kind of an honor to be selected to even work aboard it, whether he was the helper, the mechanic. Some people might take issue with that, but I never had anybody complain about having to work on it Christmas.
We were so involved in it that whenever we got home, the family dog would bite you because he didn't know who you were.
Despite her popularity and heavy government subsidies to her operators, the United States lost money every time she sailed. Regular jet service across the Atlantic made even the fastest ship in the world nothing more than a nautical curiosity. After logging over 2.5 million miles and carrying well over 1 million passengers, the United States made her final voyage in 1969.
I went aboard the United States in September, I think it was September 25th, 1955, as executive officer and relieving master. As I say, I spent 14 years in the ship, and when we brought her back to New York in November of 1969, we were due to come down here to the shipyard and came to the shipyard for our annual overhaul. I arrived home and I got a telephone call from our Marine Superintendent, Captain Green. And he says, well, they're going to button her up, going to lay her up. And that I couldn't believe. I mean, my first wife, Dorothea, broke down and started to cry. She couldn't believe.
Bought by the U.S. Maritime Administration, she was towed to a coal dock, where she sat while her hull rusted and her contents were auctioned off. A seemingly permanent fixture in the area, the great ship was allowed to decay for 23 years.
It was a terrible thing to see the ship run down that way. For instance, while we were in the shipyard, when we first laid up, they were sandblasting one of the ships at another dock, and all this fine grit and mess blew over on the United States. So the chief engineer and we got the fire hoses out, and we rigged up the fire hoses and we washed the ship down because we couldn't stand to see that dirt on board.
It was depressing to see the condition of it. Having seen it at its very best, I saw it at its very worst, so it was depressing.
Used to drive by it and see it down there, and I said, gee, you know, anything was so beautiful to see the shape it's gotten into, and it's bound to just keep on going down the tube. Wasn't good. Wasn't at all.
From time to time, rumors circulated that the ship was going to be restored to its former greatness. But on June 4th, 1992, the fastest ship in the world left Norfolk for the last time. Not under her own power, but at the end of a tugboat's line. She now rests in Turkey, where her fate is less than certain.
I didn't want to see it leave. You almost hope it would sink somewhere, you know, and it'd just go away because it had gotten so bad looking, and I knew the inside was the same way. All of that horsepower and all of that wonderful work that was done and all those people that traveled it over the years was just down the drain, you know.
The ever-increasing speed of progress ended the glamorous era of ocean liner travel. Long after the sea takes its final toll on her sleek hull, the SS United States will always be remembered as one of the proudest achievements of the people who worked to build her on the shore of the James River in Newport News.
I think everybody that worked on the United States took a lot of pride in it. I know the designers, the naval architects did, the United States Lines people did, the crew members did, and the ship, and it passed right on down to the shipyard workers, all from the bottom up and from the top down. It was all pride on that ship. I think everybody in Newport News shipbuilding took great pride in the fact that we built that ship.
While the wood of old ships may rot away, the steel of industry may rust, and buildings may be torn down, we must not forget that it is the people of Hampton Roads that give this area its unique personality. As progress leads us into a new century, the face of Hampton Roads will continue to change. We live knowing that what is in style today will look strangely out of place in the future. But we can all be secure in the knowledge that although some of our favorite people, places, and things are gone, they will never be forgotten.